At 28, Helen Brooks heard a sentence that would silently destroy the rest of her life. "You'll never be able to have a child." From that moment on, she believed she had taken something irreplaceable from the man she loved. So when her husband began to change, drinking more, speaking less, growing distant, she never blamed him. She blamed herself. For 42 years, she stayed quiet, trying to be enough in a life where she felt like she had already failed. But at 70, the day he died, everything got worse. Because in his final will, he erased her. No house, no money, no dignity. Just a rusty key and a worthless storage unit in the middle of nowhere. And standing there, with nothing left, she thought she finally understood the truth, that he never really loved her at all. Until she opened that door and found what he had been building in secret for over 40 years. So let me ask you something. If a man spent his entire life preparing a gift for a child that never existed, was it guilt? Or was it the kind of love that was simply too deep to ever be spoken? The sky hung low and gray that morning, a thin drizzle tapping softly against the windows as if the world itself was holding back tears. The air carried a quiet chill, the kind that settled deep into the bones and stayed there long after the moment had passed. At 28, Helen Brooks believed happiness was something simple, not grand, not complicated, just a warm home, a steady love, and one child to complete it all. Helen was a woman people often overlooked at first glance, not because she lacked beauty, but because hers was the kind that revealed itself slowly. She had an oval face softened by kindness, warm brown eyes that carried a quiet, almost instinctive empathy, and long chestnut hair she would gently tuck behind her ear whenever she felt uncertain. She wasn't loud. She didn't demand attention. But there was something about her presence, something calm, something grounding, that made people feel understood without a single word being spoken. Back then, she had just married Charles Brooks. Charles was a man already shaped by the world when Helen was still discovering hers. At 45, he carried the weight of experience in everything he did. His sharp jawline, deep-set eyes, and slightly furrowed brows gave him a presence that could fill a room without effort. His dark hair was always neatly combed, his suits precise, his movements controlled. People respected him. Some feared him. He was a businessman who knew how to win, and more importantly, how to never appear uncertain. But with Helen, there had once been something else, something softer. Their beginning was not dramatic. No grand declarations, no sweeping romance, just quiet dinners, long conversations, and a growing sense that they understood each other in ways that didn't need explanation. And in those early months, they dreamed. A child who would laugh in the hallways, small footsteps echoing through the house. A future that felt complete, not because it was perfect, but because it was shared. It happened on a quiet afternoon that should have meant nothing. The doctor's office smelled faintly of antiseptic and old paper. The fluorescent lights above hummed softly, casting a pale, unforgiving glow across the room. Helen sat on the edge of the chair, her hands clasped tightly together, fingers interlocked as if holding on to something invisible. Across from her sat Dr. Emily Carter. Dr. Carter was a woman in her early 40s, with short blonde hair tucked neatly behind her ears and a composed professional demeanor. But her eyes always told the truth before her words did. They carried the quiet exhaustion of someone who had spent years delivering news that changed lives forever. "Helen," she said gently, her voice careful, measured, "we've reviewed all the results." A pause, just long enough for the air to shift. "There are complications, significant ones. I'm very sorry, but it would be extremely unlikely, almost impossible, for you to carry a pregnancy." Silence. Not the kind that fills a room, the kind that empties it. Helen blinked once, then again. She waited, not for understanding, but for correction, for something softer, something that would take the edge off what she had just heard. But nothing came. Almost impossible. The words echoed over and over, until they stopped sounding like language and became something heavier, something final. She nodded, slowly, as if she understood, as if she accepted it. But deep inside, something had already begun to break. When she stepped outside, the world had not changed. Cars moved, people talked. Somewhere, a child laughed. And in that moment, Helen realized something she would never forget. The world had stayed exactly the same. Only her future had disappeared. That night, she told Charles. He stood by the window as she spoke, his back partially turned, his hands resting in his pockets. The room was dim, lit only by a single lamp that cast long shadows along the walls. Helen watched him carefully, waiting, searching for anger, disappointment, anything she could hold on to. But Charles didn't react the way she expected. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't ask questions, he didn't blame her. He simply nodded once. Then he walked past her, poured himself a drink, and said quietly, "It's all right." Just that. It's all right. But something in the room shifted, not loudly, not visibly, but permanently. At first, nothing seemed different. Charles still went to work, still dressed the same, still spoke with that same measured control. But something inside him had gone quiet, long before the drinking ever truly began. Then slowly, it appeared, a glass at night, then another, then a routine. Not enough to destroy him, but enough to change the silence between them. Helen noticed everything, and said nothing. One evening, standing by the kitchen window, she saw Charles looking across the street. A young father lifted his child into the air, laughter spilling out into the fading light. The child squealed with joy, arms reaching out without fear. Charles watched for a moment, then he looked away, almost too quickly. But Helen didn't. And in that small, almost invisible moment, a thought settled deep inside her. This is because of me. She never said it, never asked, never questioned. Instead, she adjusted. If she couldn't give him a child, she would give him everything else: peace, silence, a life without conflict. Years passed, then decades. Helen became the perfect wife in ways no one ever noticed. She remembered every important date, managed every detail of their home, hosted dinners with quiet elegance. She created a life that looked complete from the outside, even as something inside her remained unfinished. Charles continued to succeed. In business, he was admired, respected, precise. A man who never lost control. At home, he was something else. Not cruel, not unkind, but distant and unreachable in ways Helen could never quite explain. There were others in the house. Daniel Brooks, Charles's son from his first marriage. Tall, sharp-featured, with a gaze that always seemed to measure and judge. He had inherited his father's intensity, but without the restraint. Where Charles was controlled, Daniel was openly cold. At dinner, he would speak to his father without ever once looking at Helen, as if she were part of the furniture. Then there was Laura Brooks, younger, elegant, always composed. Her long blonde hair was always perfectly styled, her posture flawless, her smile polite, but never warm. She had mastered the art of civility without kindness. Laura never said anything cruel. She simply made sure Helen always understood where she did not belong. Helen tried. She tried more than anyone would ever know. She cooked their favorite meals, remembered birthdays, chose thoughtful gifts, created traditions that she hoped, quietly, patiently, might one day include her. But some distances cannot be closed by effort, and so Helen adapted. She told herself it didn't matter, that love wasn't always visible, that sacrifice was part of building something meaningful, that one day it would all make sense. And she held on to that belief for 42 years. Even as the silence deepened, even as the distance remained, even as the life she once imagined quietly slipped away. Because somewhere, deep inside, Helen still believed something simple, something stubborn, something unshaken by time, that she had been loved, that all of this had meant something. She just didn't know yet how wrong she was about to be. The room smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper, a quiet, suffocating kind of stillness that made every sound feel louder than it should be. Helen Brooks sat upright in a leather chair that felt too firm, too formal, her hands folded neatly in her lap, as if posture alone could hold her together. At 70, Her silver-gray hair was brushed carefully back, her soft brown eyes still gentle, but now lined with the quiet weight of decades spent enduring more than she had ever spoken aloud. Across from her sat Mr. Harold Whitaker, the family's longtime attorney. He was a tall, thin man in his late 60s, with neatly combed white hair and a face marked by deep lines that suggested years of difficult conversations. His rectangular glasses rested low on his nose, and his voice carried a measured calm, professional, practiced, but not entirely untouched by discomfort. He had known Charles for over 30 years, and today, he did not meet Helen's eyes as often as he should have. To her right sat Daniel. Daniel Brooks was no longer the young man she had once tried so hard to please. At 45, he had grown into a sharper, more defined version of himself, broad-shouldered, clean-cut, with a gaze that no longer tried to hide its judgment. His dark hair was styled with precision, his suit expensive, his posture relaxed in a way that suggested he already knew how this meeting would end. Next to him sat Laura. Laura Brooks had aged with elegance. In her early 40s, her long blonde hair was styled flawlessly, her makeup subtle but deliberate, her expression composed. But her eyes, those cool, calculating eyes, remained unchanged. She sat with one leg crossed over the other, fingers lightly resting on her knee, her lips curved into a polite smile that felt more like anticipation than courtesy. Helen noticed the glance they exchanged. A brief one, but unmistakable. And in that moment, something inside her tightened. Mr. Whitaker cleared his throat, unfolding the document in front of him. "We are here today," he began, his tone steady, "to review the last will and testament of Mr. Charles Brooks." The words landed with weight. Helen lowered her gaze for a moment. 42 years. She had stood beside that man for 42 years. Whatever came next, she believed, quietly, cautiously, that it would reflect that. Mr. Whitaker adjusted his glasses and began to read. The opening lines were formal, expected, language that felt distant, almost impersonal. Helen listened, but not fully. Her thoughts drifted, through years of quiet dinners, long silences, small gestures she had once believed mattered. Then came the shift. "I hereby leave all primary real estate holdings, financial accounts, business shares, and liquid assets to my children, Daniel Brooks and Laura Brooks." The words did not hit her all at once. They unfolded slowly, like something being taken apart piece by piece. Helen blinked, once, then again. She lifted her head slightly, her eyes moving toward Mr. Whitaker as if she had misheard. But he continued, steady, unchanged. Beside her, Daniel exhaled softly, not relief, but confirmation. Laura's lips pressed together in a small, satisfied smile. Their earlier glance now made sense. They had known. Of course they had known. Helen felt something shift inside her chest, not sharp, not sudden, but heavy, like something settling into place that had been waiting there for years. Mr. Whitaker paused briefly before continuing. "To my wife, Helen Brooks, I leave the property located at," he glanced down, adjusting the page slightly, "Redwood Hollow, County Route 17, commonly referred to as a storage property." A storage property. The phrase lingered in the air. Helen's fingers tightened slightly in her lap. "That property," he continued, "along with its contents, is to be transferred in full ownership to Helen Brooks. Additionally, she is granted 21 days to vacate the primary residence located at—" The rest of the address faded. Not because he stopped speaking, but because Helen stopped hearing. 21 days. A storage unit. That was what remained of 42 years. She sat still, perfectly still, because movement in that moment felt impossible. Mr. Whitaker continued reading, his voice steady, each word carefully articulated. "Mrs. Brooks has been provided for throughout the duration of the marriage and is considered to have received adequate support." Adequate support. Helen's breath caught, but only slightly. Not enough for anyone else to notice, but inside, something cracked. Not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that could not be undone. Daniel leaned back in his chair, one arm resting casually along the backrest, his expression now fully relaxed. Laura crossed her legs more comfortably, her posture easing as if a quiet tension had finally been released. Helen noticed everything. The way they no longer bothered to hide it. The way she had already become irrelevant. Mr. Whitaker closed the document gently. That concludes the will. Silence followed. A different kind of silence than the one she had known before. This one did not feel empty, it felt final. Helen nodded once, a small, almost automatic motion. "Thank you," she said softly. Her voice sounded distant, even to herself. The meeting ended shortly after. No arguments, no raised voices. Because Helen did not fight. Not then, not yet. That evening, the house felt different. Not because anything had changed physically, but because everything had. Daniel stood in the living room, speaking with a contractor, a broad, middle-aged man named Rick Dalton, whose sun-weathered skin and thick forearms suggested years of physical labor. Rick spoke in practical terms, pointing out walls, measurements, potential renovations. His tone was neutral, businesslike. To him, this was just another job. "To increase the value, we'd probably open up this wall," Rick said, gesturing casually. "Modern buyers like space." Daniel nodded. "Do it." No hesitation, no discussion. Laura stood nearby, scrolling through her phone before glancing up. "We should list it within the month," she said. "The market's good right now." Then she looked at Helen. Not unkindly, but not kindly either. "You'll want to start packing soon," she added, her voice light, almost conversational. 21 days goes by quickly." Helen stood near the doorway, her hands resting lightly against the frame. She listened, she watched. And for the first time in a very long time, she did not step forward. She did not offer input, did not adjust, did not try. Because something inside her had finally gone quiet. Later that night, as the house settled into silence, Helen sat alone in the kitchen. The same kitchen where she had spent years cooking meals no one remembered. The same table where she had sat through countless quiet dinners. Her fingers traced the edge of a cup that had long gone cold. A storage unit. She turned the words over in her mind, again and again. If he didn't love me, her chest tightened. Then why that? Why not nothing? Why not erase her completely? But he hadn't. He had left her something, something specific, something intentional. And that question, small at first, almost insignificant, began to grow. Not loudly, not clearly, but persistently. For 42 years, Helen had believed she understood her marriage. Understood the silence, understood the distance, understood the man she had loved. But sitting there, in the quiet of a house that was no longer hers, she realized something she had never allowed herself to consider before. Maybe she hadn't understood anything at all. The house no longer sounded the same. It wasn't just quieter, it was hollow in a way Helen had never felt before. The soft hum of life that once lived in its walls had been replaced by sharp, intrusive noises. Hammering, drilling, voices that didn't belong. On the first morning after the will was read, Helen woke before dawn, her eyes heavy but unwilling to close again. She lay still in bed, staring at the ceiling she had memorized over 42 years, as if trying to hold on to something that was already slipping away. By mid-morning, the first crew arrived. Daniel stood at the front door, greeting them with a firm handshake and a voice that carried authority without effort. At 45, he moved like a man who had spent his life being listened to. His posture was straight, his gestures precise, and there was something in the way he gave instructions, efficient, detached, that made it clear this was no longer a home in his eyes. It was a project, an asset, a transaction waiting to be completed. "Start with the walls," he said, pointing toward the living room. "We'll open this space up, make it brighter, more modern." Helen stood at the edge of the hallway, her hands lightly resting against the wooden frame, her fingers unconsciously tracing the small scratch marks left years ago when Charles had moved a cabinet too quickly. She wanted to say something, to tell them to stop, to remind them that every corner of this house had been shaped by years of quiet care, but the words never formed. Laura arrived shortly after, her presence as composed as ever. She wore a light-colored coat, tailored perfectly to her frame, her blonde hair styled with effortless precision. At first glance, she looked warm, even approachable, but the longer one watched her, the more something colder revealed itself beneath the surface. She walked slowly through the house, her eyes scanning everything with a critical calm. "These curtains," she said, pausing in the living room, her fingers brushing the fabric with mild disapproval. "They make the space feel smaller, heavy. We should replace them." Helen followed her gaze. Those curtains had been chosen on a rainy afternoon decades ago, when she and Charles had still made decisions together. She remembered laughing that day, softly, shyly, as he pretended to argue over colors he clearly didn't care about. For a moment, the memory flickered, and then disappeared beneath Laura's voice. "And the furniture," Laura continued, stepping back slightly, tilting her head. "It's outdated. It doesn't match what buyers are looking for now." Buyers. The word landed harder than it should have. That evening, Helen sat at the dining table alone. The chairs had already been shifted out of place, one of them leaning awkwardly against the wall, as if it no longer belonged there. Dust floated in the air, catching the dim light from the ceiling fixture. She placed her hands on the table, her palms flat against the surface, feeling the familiar texture beneath her skin. For years, she had believed that if she endured quietly, if she gave enough, adjusted enough, stayed patient enough, something lasting would remain. Something that would prove it had all meant something. Now, as voices echoed from another room, Daniel discussing renovation timelines, Laura talking about listing prices, Helen realized how fragile that belief had been. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat by the window in the kitchen, watching the street in silence. The world outside moved as it always had. A car passed. A distant porch light flickered on. Somewhere, a dog barked and then fell quiet again. Life continued, indifferent to what had just ended inside her. Her mind wandered to places she had avoided for years. What would happen now? She had no income, no savings of her own, no place that truly belonged to her. The future stretched out before her, not as possibility, but as uncertainty wrapped in quiet fear. She imagined small, cramped rooms, cold mornings, loneliness that echoed louder than anything she had ever known. And for the first time, she didn't push the thought away. Instead, she sat with it. The fear didn't disappear, but it changed. It softened into something else, something quieter but stronger. A question. Had she ever lived for herself? The thought unsettled her at first. It felt almost wrong to consider. For decades, her life had been defined by what others needed, what others expected, what others took. She had measured her worth by how well she endured, how much she gave, how little she asked for in return. But sitting there, in the dim light of a house that was no longer hers, Helen began to see that pattern clearly for the first time. And once she saw it, she couldn't unsee it. The following days blurred together. Workers came and went. Walls were marked. Measurements were taken. Conversations about square footage and resale value filled the spaces where laughter had once lived. Helen moved through it all quietly. She packed slowly, deliberately. Each item she placed into her suitcase carried weight, not just physical, but emotional. A folded sweater, a worn book, a small photograph tucked into the corner of a drawer. She didn't take much. There wasn't much she could claim. Daniel barely spoke to her unless necessary. When he did, his tone remained polite but distant, like one might speak to a tenant nearing the end of a lease. Laura, on the other hand, maintained her composed civility. "You'll want to be ready by the end of the week," she said one afternoon, her voice calm, almost gentle. "It will make things easier for everyone." For everyone. Helen nodded. She didn't argue. On the final day, the house felt unfamiliar, not because it had changed, but because she had. Her 2 suitcases stood by the door. The space around her looked larger now, emptier, stripped of something invisible but essential. She took one last look around, not at the walls, not at the furniture, but at the life she had lived there. There was no anger, not anymore. Only a quiet understanding. She reached for the handle of her suitcase, her grip steady. Her shoulders, though slightly bowed with age, held a different kind of strength now, not the strength of endurance, but the strength of awareness. As she stepped outside, the air felt different, cooler, clearer. The car waiting for her idled quietly at the curb. The driver, a middle-aged man with kind eyes and a weathered face, stepped out to help with her bags. His name was Marcus, a man in his early 50s, broad-shouldered with graying hair and a calm, grounded presence that suggested a life built on steady work rather than ambition. He spoke gently, without unnecessary words, and there was something reassuring in his simplicity. "Long drive ahead," he said softly, placing her suitcase in the trunk. Helen nodded. She took one last glance at the house. Then she turned away. As the car pulled onto the road, the distance between her and the life she had known began to grow, slowly at first, then steadily. Helen sat quietly, her hands resting in her lap, her gaze fixed ahead. And somewhere along that road, something shifted inside her. For the first time in decades, her future did not belong to someone else. She did not know what waited for her at the end of that journey, but she knew one thing. This time, she would live for herself. The road narrowed long before Helen realized they had left the main highway behind. The city had faded into scattered buildings, then into open stretches of land, and finally into a quiet, dense forest that seemed to swallow sound itself. The car moved steadily along a winding dirt path, gravel crunching beneath the tires, branches arching overhead like a tunnel of time. Helen sat in the back seat, her hands resting still in her lap, her posture composed but inwardly alert. She had imagined many things about this storage property, a cold structure, perhaps abandoned, perhaps neglected, but nothing about this journey matched those expectations. Marcus drove with quiet focus. His hands remained steady on the wheel, his movements unhurried, as if he had traveled this road many times before. There was a calmness to him that Helen found difficult to explain. He did not fill the silence with unnecessary words, but neither did the silence feel uncomfortable. It simply existed. "We're close," he said softly after a while, his voice low but clear. Helen nodded, her eyes shifting toward the window. The trees grew denser, taller, their shadows stretching across the narrow path. There was a stillness here that felt almost deliberate, as if the world beyond this place had been gently kept away. Then, suddenly, the trees opened. The car slowed, and there it was. Helen leaned forward slightly, her breath catching in a way she did not expect. It was not a storage unit. It was a house. Not large, not extravagant, but carefully built, nestled quietly among the trees, its structure blending naturally with the forest around it. The wooden exterior was aged but well-maintained, the porch clean, the windows intact. There was no sign of abandonment, no sign of neglect, only care. Marcus stepped out first, moving around the car to open Helen's door. "Take your time," he said gently. Helen stepped onto the gravel, her eyes fixed on the house. Her grip tightened slightly around the handle of her bag, not from fear, but from something deeper, something unfamiliar, confusion. They walked toward the front door slowly. Each step felt heavier than the last. Helen reached out, her fingers brushing lightly against the wooden surface of the door. The wood was smooth, clean, recently cared for. She hesitated, then, slowly, she pushed it open. The door creaked softly, not from disrepair but from age, and then she stopped. Everything inside her stilled. The air inside the house was warm, not physically warm, but lived in. The space was simple, but carefully arranged. A small table stood near the center of the room, a lamp resting neatly on top. A woven rug lay flat across the wooden floor. The shelves along the wall were not empty. They held books, small objects, things placed with intention rather than convenience. This was not storage. This was a life. Helen took a step forward, her eyes moving slowly across the room, trying to understand what she was seeing. Her breathing grew quieter, slower, as if any sudden movement might break whatever this place was. Then her gaze stopped. On the wall. Photographs, dozens of them. Her. Helen moved closer, almost without realizing it. Her fingers lifted slightly, hovering near the surface of one frame but not quite touching it. There she was, years younger, standing in the garden behind the house she had once called home. Another photo, her sitting at the dining table, unaware, looking down at something in her hands. Another, her by the window, the same window where she had spent so many sleepless nights. Moments she had lived. Moments she had never known were being seen. Her breath caught. How? The word barely formed. You found them. The voice came from behind her. Helen turned slowly. A woman stood near the doorway that led deeper into the house. She was in her late 60s, her posture straight despite the quiet weight of age. Her hair, a soft silver white, was pulled back loosely, a few strands framing her face. Her skin was lined gently, not harshly, but in the way of someone who had lived a steady, thoughtful life. She wore simple clothing, practical and clean, her hands resting calmly at her sides. There was nothing hurried about her presence, nothing uncertain. "My name is Martha," she said, her voice even, grounded, carrying a quiet warmth that did not demand trust, but did not avoid it either. Helen studied her for a moment, her eyes searching for something, an answer, perhaps, or a contradiction. "I don't understand," Helen said finally, her voice softer than she intended. Martha nodded once, as if she had expected those exact words. "No," she replied gently, "you wouldn't." She stepped slightly closer, though still leaving space between them. "He came here," Martha continued, her gaze steady. "Every month, for 40 years. Helen's expression didn't change immediately. It couldn't. The words didn't settle all at once. They unfolded, slowly, quietly, just like the will had. "At first it was just visits," Martha said. "A few hours at a time, then longer stays. Eventually, this became part of his life." Helen's eyes shifted back toward the photographs. Her mind tried to follow the timeline, to place these moments into something that made sense, but nothing did. "He took those?" Helen asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Martha nodded. "He watched you," she said, "not in the way you might think. He never interfered, never crossed a line, but he paid attention." Helen's hand lowered slowly, her fingers curled slightly as if holding on to something invisible. "Why?" she asked. Martha's gaze softened. "Because he couldn't be the man he thought you deserved," she said quietly. The words landed differently this time, not like the will, not like the rejection, but like something that required understanding. "He built this place," Martha continued, gesturing lightly around the room. "Not as an escape, but as a way to hold on to the parts of his life he didn't know how to live anywhere else." Helen's chest rose slowly, her breath uneven. For years, she had believed that silence meant absence, that distance meant indifference, that what was missing had simply never existed. But standing here, surrounded by evidence of something she had never seen, Helen began to feel something shift again. Not closure, not yet, but doubt. And within that doubt, possibility. "This isn't what you think it is," Martha said gently. Helen looked at her. For the first time since entering the house, her eyes were no longer searching for answers. They were beginning to ask new questions, and deep down, beneath the confusion, beneath the hurt, beneath everything she thought she knew, Helen realized something. This wasn't abandonment, this was a secret. The discovery of the photographs did not bring Helen peace. It unsettled her in a deeper way, like a door had been opened, but the room beyond it was still too dark to see clearly. She stood in the quiet house for a long time after Martha finished speaking, her eyes drifting between the frames on the wall and the objects carefully arranged around the room. Nothing here felt accidental. Nothing felt forgotten. And yet, everything felt hidden. It was Helen who noticed the door. It stood near the back of the house, partially concealed behind a tall wooden shelf filled with old books and small storage boxes. It wasn't locked. It wasn't even fully hidden. It was simply not meant to be seen unless someone was looking for something they didn't yet understand. "What's behind that?" Helen asked, her voice steady, though something inside her had already begun to shift. Martha followed her gaze, then nodded once. "He never asked me to hide it," she said quietly, "only to leave it as it is. Helen stepped closer. Her hand hovered briefly before resting against the handle. The wood was cool beneath her fingers. She opened the door. A narrow staircase descended into darkness. For a moment, she hesitated, not out of fear, but out of the strange awareness that whatever waited below would change something inside her permanently. Then she stepped down. The air grew cooler as she descended, carrying with it a faint, unmistakable scent, rich, aged, and layered with time. Wine. At the bottom of the stairs, Helen stopped. The space before her stretched wider than she expected, illuminated by a series of soft overhead lights. The cellar was not crude or improvised. It was carefully built, structured with intention. Wooden racks lined the walls, extending from floor to ceiling, each one filled. Barrels. Dozens at first glance, then hundreds. Helen took a slow step forward, her eyes moving from one to another. Each barrel was marked, not randomly, but precisely. Dates. Years. Neatly written, consistent, deliberate. Her breath grew uneven. 1979, she whispered, reading one marking, then another. 1985? 1992? Her fingers brushed lightly against the wood of one barrel, as if confirming that it was real. Behind her, Martha remained at the base of the stairs, silent, allowing the moment to unfold on its own. Helen moved deeper into the cellar, her steps slow, reverent. There was a small table placed near the center of the room. On it, a single envelope rested. Her name was written on the front, Helen. The handwriting was familiar, too familiar. Her hands trembled as she reached for it. For a moment, she simply held it, her thumb tracing the edges as if delaying the inevitable. Then she opened it. The paper inside had aged slightly, the ink still clear. She began to read. Helen, if you are reading this, it means you found the place I could never explain to you. Her breath caught. She continued. I started making this wine the year we got married, not because I loved wine, but because I loved what it could become. Something that takes time, something that grows quietly, something that only reveals its true value years later. Helen's grip tightened slightly on the paper. I had a simple plan back then. When our child turned 25 and stood at the beginning of their own life, on the day of their wedding, we would open these barrels together. We would share them with friends, with family, with a room full of people who belonged to something we built. The words blurred for a moment. Helen blinked, steadying herself. But life did not follow the path I imagined, and when we learned the truth, I didn't know how to let go of that future. Not because I blamed you, never that, but because I didn't know how to bury something that had never had the chance to live. A tear slipped down Helen's cheek. So I kept going. Every year I came here. I worked. I waited. I aged the wine the way I thought time might soften the things I couldn't fix. Helen's shoulders trembled slightly, but she did not stop reading. You thought I was drinking to forget, but the truth is, I was trying to preserve something I couldn't bear to lose. This place was never meant to replace our life. It was the part of it I didn't know how to share without hurting you. Helen lowered the letter slightly, her breath uneven. Around her, the cellar felt different now. Not hidden, not secret, but revealed. She looked again at the barrels. Year after year. He hadn't stopped. Even when there was no child. Even when there was no future waiting to fulfill that plan. He had continued, not out of denial, but out of devotion. Helen stepped slowly between the rows, her fingers brushing lightly against the barrels as she passed them. 25 years, 30, 40, more. The wine had aged beyond its original purpose, beyond its original meaning. What had once been intended for a single moment, a wedding, a celebration, a beginning, had transformed into something else entirely. Something rare, something valuable, something that had endured. Helen stopped in the center of the cellar, the letter still in her hand. Her tears no longer came from confusion. They came from understanding. For years, she had believed that Charles had been slipping away from her, losing himself in something she could not reach. But now she saw it clearly. He hadn't been escaping. He had been holding on. Holding on to a version of their life that had never been allowed to exist. Holding on to a future that had been taken from them before it could begin. And he had done it alone, so that she wouldn't have to carry that weight. Helen closed her eyes briefly, her chest rising slowly. When she opened them again, the cellar no longer felt like a place of loss. It felt like something else, a testament to time, to patience, to a love that had never been spoken the way it should have been, but had never disappeared. She looked once more at the rows of barrels, at the years carved into each one. Then, quietly, almost to herself, she whispered, "You didn't stop." Her voice broke, not in pain, but in something softer, something fuller. For the first time in decades, Helen did not feel abandoned. She did not feel replaced. She did not feel forgotten. She felt seen. And in that moment, standing in a cellar built for a wedding that had never happened, Helen understood something that changed everything. What they had lost had not been the end of their story. It had simply taken a different form. And somehow, against all odds, it had endured. The quiet did not last long. For a few days after discovering the cellar, Helen allowed herself to exist in a rare kind of stillness, one that did not feel empty, but full. The house in the forest no longer felt like a mystery waiting to be solved. It felt like a truth she was slowly learning to live with. Each morning, she walked through the rooms with a different awareness, her fingers occasionally brushing the edges of furniture Charles had once chosen, her eyes lingering on small details she might have overlooked before. But truth, like anything valuable, rarely stays hidden. It began with a visitor. Not Daniel, not Laura, someone else. A man named Gregory Hale. He arrived unannounced one late afternoon, his car stopping just outside the gravel clearing with a quiet authority that suggested habit rather than hesitation. When he stepped out, his presence carried a kind of practiced confidence, neither aggressive nor warm, but carefully balanced. Gregory was in his early 60s, tall and lean, his posture straight, his movements precise. His hair was silver but thick, combed neatly back, and his face bore the sharp lines of a man who had spent decades negotiating outcomes rather than emotions. His suit was understated but expensive, tailored to fit without drawing attention. He introduced himself politely. "I represent several collectors," he said, his voice smooth, measured. "We've recently become aware of something of interest here." Helen stood on the porch as he spoke, her expression unreadable. "Word travels quickly," she replied. Gregory gave a slight smile. "It always does, when value is involved." He didn't step inside. He didn't need to. Men like him understood boundaries and how to test them without crossing too far. "I'd like to discuss a possible acquisition," he continued. Discreetly. Helen shook her head once. "Not today." Gregory studied her for a moment, not with irritation, but with recalibration. Then he nodded. "I'll be in touch," he said, before turning back to his car. And just like that, the quiet was gone. By the next morning, the calls began, then the messages, then the emails. Names she didn't recognize, offers she didn't fully understand. Numbers that would have once seemed unimaginable, now written casually, as if they meant nothing at all. Helen didn't respond. She didn't need to, because by the third day, Daniel and Laura arrived. This time they didn't come alone. A black sedan pulled into the clearing, followed closely by another vehicle. When the doors opened, Daniel stepped out first, his expression harder than before, his movements sharper, less controlled. Laura followed, her usual composure still present, but thinner now, stretched by urgency rather than confidence. Behind them came a man Helen had never seen. Shorter than Daniel, heavier in build, with thinning hair and a face that carried the dull fatigue of someone who had spent too many years in rooms filled with arguments. He adjusted his tie as he stepped forward, his eyes already scanning the property. "Mrs. Brooks," he said, offering a brief nod. "I'm Whitaker, counsel." Helen didn't invite them in. They walked forward anyway. The conversation began before the door even fully closed behind them. "This needs to be addressed," Daniel said, his voice direct, stripped of any attempt at politeness. Helen said nothing. Laura stepped in, her tone smoother but no less calculated. "We've reviewed the situation," she said, "and there are legal concerns." "About what?" Helen asked calmly. Whitaker cleared his throat slightly. "The wine," he said. "It was produced during the course of the marriage. That introduces a claim of shared marital assets." The words were clean, clinical, designed to sound inevitable. Daniel crossed his arms. "You didn't make this alone," he added. "That means it doesn't belong to you alone." Helen looked at him for a long moment. For the first time in decades, she didn't feel the need to explain herself. Instead, she turned, walked to a small wooden cabinet near the wall, and opened it. Inside was a folder. Thin, simple, but precise. She carried it back, placing it gently on the table between them. "Read," she said. Whitaker stepped forward, opening the file with practiced hands. His eyes moved quickly at first, then slowed, then stopped. The room shifted. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. But something changed. "This property," Whitaker said slowly, his voice tightening almost imperceptibly, "was transferred years ago." Helen said nothing. Daniel stepped closer. "What does that mean?" Whitaker didn't answer immediately. He continued reading. There were signatures, dates, clauses, details that had not been left open to interpretation. "It means," Whitaker said finally, closing the folder halfway, "this asset is not subject to division under standard marital claim." Silence. Not confusion. Not disbelief. Something heavier. Laura's expression tightened, just slightly. Daniel's jaw shifted. "But the production," Daniel began. Helen interrupted him, not loudly, not sharply, but firmly. "You're not here because of the law," she said. That stopped him. She reached into the folder again, pulled out a second document. Thinner, more discreet. She didn't hand it over. She simply opened it. Let them see just enough. A few lines, a few names, a few details that did not belong in daylight conversations. Whitaker's expression changed first. Not dramatically, but enough. He understood. Daniel noticed it. Laura noticed it. Helen closed the document. Carefully. "I'm not asking for anything," she said quietly. "I'm not taking anything from you." Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "But I will protect what is mine." The words settled into the room like weight. No one interrupted. No one argued. Because this was no longer a negotiation. It was a boundary. For the first time in 42 years, Helen wasn't the one being cornered. Daniel looked at her differently now. Not with anger, not with superiority, but with something unfamiliar. Caution. Laura exhaled slowly, her posture adjusting just slightly, as if recalculating a situation she no longer controlled. Whitaker closed the folder fully this time. "I think," he said carefully, "we have enough information." Daniel didn't respond immediately, but he stepped back, just half a step. It was enough. They didn't win, they didn't lose, but they understood. And sometimes, that's all it takes. They left the same way they arrived, quietly, without resolution, but not without consequence. The car doors closed, the engine started, and the clearing returned to silence. Helen stood alone again, but this time, it was different. She wasn't waiting. She wasn't enduring. She wasn't hoping for something to be returned to her. She was standing in something that already belonged to her. Not just the house, not just the cellar, but herself. She turned slowly, her gaze moving through the room, not searching, not questioning, recognizing. For the first time in decades, the past no longer held her in place. It had released her. And she didn't need to look back. The cellar no longer felt like a place of discovery. It felt like a question. For several days after Daniel and Laura left, Helen found herself returning there again and again. Not out of curiosity, but out of something quieter, deeper. She would walk slowly down the narrow staircase, her hand brushing lightly along the wall, as if grounding herself in each step, until the cool air of the cellar settled around her like a familiar presence. She did not rush anymore. She stood, she observed, she listened, not to sound, but to memory. The rows of barrels no longer overwhelmed her. They spoke, not in words, but in time. Each year carved into the wood felt like a heartbeat she had once missed. Each layer of aging wine carried something she had never fully understood while Charles was still alive. It was no longer just about what he had done. It was about what he had endured in silence. And now, standing there alone, Helen realized something she had never allowed herself to consider before. This was not just an inheritance, this was a life. A dream that had never been lived, but had never been abandoned. She closed her eyes briefly, her breath slow and steady. She could sell everything. The thought came clearly, cleanly, without hesitation. The numbers she had begun to hear over the past week were more than enough to secure a future most people would never even imagine. Comfort, security, ease, a life without worry. At 70 years old, that kind of certainty held its own quiet appeal. But the feeling didn't stay, because something about it felt incomplete. She opened her eyes again, her gaze moving across the barrels, decades of patience, of intention, of something that had outlived its original purpose. If she sold all of it, what would remain? Money, yes. Freedom, perhaps. But meaning? That was less certain. And for the first time in her life, Helen understood that meaning mattered more than comfort. The realization did not come like a sudden revelation. It arrived slowly, gently, like something that had been waiting for her to be ready. She took a step forward, her fingers brushing one of the older barrels, its wood darker, its surface marked by time in ways newer ones were not. "This wasn't meant to disappear," she whispered softly. Her voice echoed faintly in the cellar, not as a statement, but as a truth. Later that afternoon, she sat at the small wooden table near the center of the room, the letter still beside her. The same letter she had read so many times in the past few days that she no longer needed to follow every word to understand it. But this time, she wasn't reading it, she was thinking beyond it. "What would you have done?" she asked quietly into the stillness. The question lingered, but no answer came. And then she realized there didn't need to be one. Because for the first time, the decision wasn't his. It was hers. The following morning, Helen made a call. Not to Gregory, not yet. Instead, she contacted someone Martha had mentioned in passing days earlier, a woman who lived in the nearest town, known not for wealth, but for work. Her name was Eleanor Shaw. Eleanor was in her late 50s, with a slender frame that carried a quiet resilience. Her hair, a soft blend of ash brown and gray, was always tied back loosely at the nape of her neck. Her face was not striking in a conventional way, but it held a steadiness that came from years of listening to others without judgment. She dressed simply, neutral colors, practical fabrics, but there was a quiet dignity in the way she carried herself. She had spent most of her life working with women, not in grand institutions, but in small rooms, in community centers, in spaces where people came not because they had solutions, but because they had nowhere else to go. When she arrived at the house, she did not look surprised. She did not look impressed. She looked attentive. Helen appreciated that. They sat across from each other at the same table in the cellar, not because it was dramatic, but because it felt honest. "I'm not here to sell," Helen said. Eleanor nodded once. "Then why am I here?" Helen took a breath. "Because the answer mattered. I want to build something," she said. Eleanor waited. "I don't know exactly what it looks like yet," Helen continued, "but I know who it's for." She paused, then spoke more clearly. "For women who couldn't have children." Eleanor's expression did not change dramatically, but something in her eyes softened. Helen continued. "Not just medical help," she said. "That matters, but it's not everything." Her voice steadied as she spoke. "I mean the part that comes after, the silence, the guilt, the feeling that something essential is missing, and that you're the reason it's missing." Eleanor leaned forward slightly, listening, fully. "I lived with that for most of my life," Helen said. "And I don't think I ever questioned it. I just accepted it." The cellar remained still around them. But the conversation shifted something within it. "And now?" Eleanor asked gently. Helen looked down briefly at the letter beside her, then back up. "Now I think it was never the whole truth." Eleanor nodded slowly. That was enough. They spent hours talking, not about structure, not about funding, but about people. Real ones, stories, patterns, needs that weren't always visible from the outside. By the time Eleanor left, the shape of something had begun to form. Not fully, but clearly enough. That evening, Helen called Gregory. This time, she invited him to return. When he arrived, his approach was the same as before, measured, controlled, observant. But Helen was different. "I'm willing to sell," she said. Gregory did not interrupt. "Not all of it," she added. That caught his attention. She explained her terms. A limited release, carefully selected barrels, the oldest, the rarest. Not just sold, but positioned, presented, with context, with story. Gregory listened carefully, and for the first time since he had arrived days earlier, he looked at her not as a potential client, but as someone who understood value. Not just in numbers, but in meaning. "This will attract attention," he said. Helen nodded. "That's the point." The first sale happened weeks later, quietly, discreetly, but powerfully. And with it, the beginning of something new. Helen named it simply, the Second Spring Foundation. It wasn't large, not yet, but it didn't need to be, because its purpose was clear: to support women who had spent years believing their worth was tied to something they could not have, to help them find something else, not a replacement, but a continuation, something that could still grow, even after loss. Each bottle sold carried a story, not of what had been lost, but of what had endured, and what could still begin again. For the first time in her life, Helen was not reacting to circumstances, she was shaping them. And the decision she had made was not just about the wine. It was about who she had finally allowed herself to become. A year passed more quietly than Helen had expected. Not empty, but full in a different way. The Forest House no longer felt like a place hidden from the world. It had become something else entirely. Not public, not crowded, but open in a way that allowed people to arrive not by accident, but by intention. The path leading to the house had changed. Where there had once only been tire marks and fallen leaves, there was now a gently maintained gravel trail, lined with low lantern lights that glowed softly in the evening. Nothing extravagant, nothing excessive, just enough to say, "You are welcome here." On a cool autumn afternoon, Helen stood near the entrance of the house, her hands resting lightly in front of her, her posture calm, grounded. At 71, her silver-gray hair was now worn slightly shorter than before, framing her face more openly. There was a softness in her features that had not been there a year ago, not because life had become easier, but because something inside her had settled. She was no longer waiting for something to be returned. She was living in what she had chosen. Inside, the house was filled with quiet movement. Not chaos, not noise, but presence. A small gathering had come together. Not investors, not collectors, people. Women mostly, some older, some younger. Each carrying something invisible, but deeply felt. Helen did not know all of their names yet, but she recognized something in each of them, because she had once carried it too. Near the long wooden table in the main room stood a woman named Rachel Kim. She was in her early 40s, of Korean-American background, with shoulder-length dark hair pulled loosely behind her ears. Her posture was slightly guarded, as if she had learned to hold herself together even when things inside felt uncertain. Her hands rested near a glass she hadn't yet lifted, her fingers tracing its edge absent-mindedly. There was a quiet strength in her, but also a history of disappointment that had not fully faded. Beside her stood Maria Alvarez, mid-50s, with warm olive-toned skin and soft brown eyes that carried both exhaustion and kindness. Her body was fuller, her presence grounded, the kind of woman who had spent most of her life taking care of others before ever considering herself. She spoke gently, but when she smiled, it reached deeply, like something hard-earned. Across the room, near one of the windows, was a younger woman named Emily Carter. Early 30s, tall and slender, with light brown hair tied back in a loose ponytail. Her face still held traces of recent grief, subtle but present in the way her eyes lingered on certain moments just a little longer than necessary. She held a small notebook in her hands, as if afraid she might forget something important if she didn't write it down. They were different, in age, in story, in the paths that had brought them here. But they shared something Helen understood without needing explanation: loss, and the long silence that follows it. The table at the center of the room had been prepared simply. No grand decorations, no elaborate arrangements. Just a clean white cloth, a few candles, and several bottles of wine, drawn from the cellar below. The first bottles, carefully selected, carefully opened, not for a wedding, but for something else. Helen stepped forward slowly as the room began to settle. Conversations softened, movement paused, attention shifted, not because she demanded it, but because something in her presence invited it. She reached for one of the bottles, her movements unhurried, her hands steady. As she poured the wine into a series of glasses, the soft sound of liquid meeting glass filled the quiet space between them. No one rushed. No one spoke over the moment. When she finished, she lifted her glass, but not high, just enough to be seen, enough to be shared. For a brief moment, she didn't speak. Her eyes moved across the room, not scanning, recognizing. Rachel, Maria, Emily, others, each one standing there with their own version of a story that had once felt like an ending. Helen took a small breath, then she spoke. "Thank you for being here," she said. Her voice was gentle but clear. "This wasn't how it was meant to begin." A faint smile touched her lips. "But I've learned that not everything has to begin the way we expected it to." A few of the women nodded, not in agreement, but in understanding. Helen continued. "For a long time, I believed that something essential had been taken from me," she said. "And I didn't question it. I carried it, quietly." Her fingers tightened slightly around the glass, but her voice remained steady. "But now I see it was never the end of my story." The room held that truth with her, not as an idea, but as something lived. She glanced briefly toward the cellar door, then back. "This wine," she said softly, "was meant for a celebration that never happened." A pause. "But that doesn't mean it was wasted." Her gaze moved again across the faces in front of her. "It just waited." The word lingered, and in that single moment, something shifted in the room, not dramatically, but deeply. Helen lifted her glass slightly higher this time. "To second beginnings," she said, not louder, just fuller. The glasses around her rose in response, not in perfect timing, not in rehearsed unity, but in something more honest. They drank, and for the first time, the wine fulfilled a purpose it had been waiting decades to reach. Not the one it was created for, but one it had become worthy of. Later that evening, the conversations grew warmer, more open. Rachel spoke, slowly at first, about years of treatments that had left her feeling more like a process than a person. Maria shared stories of raising other people's children, while quietly grieving the absence of her own. Emily, after a long silence, read a few lines from her notebook, words she had written but never spoken aloud. There were tears, but they did not carry the same weight as before. They moved differently now, not as endings, but as releases. Helen stood slightly apart for a moment, watching, not overseeing, not managing, just witnessing. And in that space, she felt something she had not allowed herself to feel in a very long time. Peace. Not because everything had been resolved, but because something had been transformed. Gregory stood near the edge of the room, unobtrusive as always, observing quietly. He did not interrupt, he did not guide. But there was a subtle shift in the way he watched now, not as a broker, not as a strategist, but as someone who understood that value did not always come from rarity alone. Sometimes it came from meaning. Helen noticed him briefly and gave a small nod. Nothing more. That was enough. As the evening settled, the lantern lights outside began to glow softly along the path. The forest beyond remained still, unchanged, holding the house in its quiet embrace. Inside, something had changed. Not loudly, not dramatically, but permanently. Helen stepped back toward the table once more, her fingers resting lightly against the wood. She lifted her glass again, but this time her voice did not follow. The words she spoke next were not meant for the room, only for herself. "We had our celebration," she whispered. A pause. "Just a little later than I thought." Her eyes softened, and this time there was no regret in them, only recognition, because the dream she had once believed was lost had not disappeared. It had changed form, expanded, reached further than she could have imagined. At 71, Helen Brooks was not starting over. She was continuing. And for the first time in her life, she was not doing it alone.
In the end, Helen didn't just inherit a cellar of wine, she inherited a second chance to understand her own life. What once felt like loss slowly revealed itself as something deeper, a love that had endured in silence, and a purpose that had been waiting patiently to be discovered. Instead of holding on to regret, Helen chose to transform it. She turned a dream that never came true into hope for others who were still searching for meaning, and in doing so, she found something she had never truly felt before, not just peace, but belonging. Life doesn't always give us what we expect, but sometimes it gives us something far greater in return. Helen's journey reminds us that even the most painful chapters can lead to something beautiful when we choose to see beyond them. And sometimes what we thought was the end is simply the beginning of something new. Before you go, I want to leave you with a simple thought. Sometimes we spend years asking, why did this happen to me? But maybe, just maybe, God was preparing something we couldn't yet understand. Helen thought her story had ended in loss, but in God's timing, it became a story of purpose, healing, and quiet miracles. So if you're carrying something heavy today, a regret, a loss, or a dream that never came true, don't give up, because what feels like an ending might, if this story touched your heart, take a moment to like, share, and tell us where you're watching from. Your story matters too. Leave a comment below. What is one thing in your life you're still learning to understand? And don't forget to subscribe so we can keep bringing you stories that heal, inspire, and remind you you are never alone. May God bless you, guide you, and bring peace into your life, one quiet miracle at a time.